A millionaire stands at the altar, moments from sealing a powerful union with his high society fiancée. The champagne flows, guests whisper, and cameras flash. Then, he sees her. The waitress serving drinks. The woman he loved. The wife who vanished without a trace. And she's pregnant. Before he can even speak, the tray crashes to the floor. She runs. He follows. Why did she disappear? Why didn't she tell him? And if the baby is his, what else has been kept from him? His wedding is unraveling. His past is colliding with his present. And the truth waiting for him could destroy everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Gabriel Thornton adjusted his bow tie for the third time, staring at his reflection in the full-length mirror. The custom-tailored tuxedo fit perfectly. Of course it did. But something felt off. Not the suit. Him. "You look like a man heading to his execution, not his wedding," Richard Thornton said, appearing in the doorway of the guest suite. His father's imposing figure, still commanding at 65, filled the frame with practiced authority. "Just pre-wedding jitters," Gabriel replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The Thornton-Palmer merger?" Richard caught himself. "Marriage. The marriage is exactly what both families need. Vivienne understands our world. Unlike Isabel." The unspoken comparison hung in the air between them. 8 months. 8 months since Isabel had vanished from his life without explanation, leaving only a brief note. "I can't do this anymore. Please don't look for me." 8 months since he'd thrown himself into work, then into the whirlwind romance with Vivienne that had somehow led to today. "Perfect weather for a perfect day," Richard continued, gesturing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the Thornton coastal estate. The manicured lawns rolled down to the private beach where white chairs were arranged in precise rows facing an elaborate floral arch. The sky was a brilliant blue, the ocean beyond a deeper shade that matched the family's shipping line colors. Too perfect, too orchestrated. "I need a minute," Gabriel said. His father clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't be late. 300 guests and the Palmer family aren't accustomed to waiting." When the door closed, Gabriel loosened his tie and drew a deep breath. He'd done everything right. Built the sustainable shipping division his father had initially mocked. Dated the socially appropriate woman after his unfortunate first marriage had ended. Yet the hollow feeling in his chest had only grown. The knock at the door came precisely on schedule. "Mr. Thornton, the pre-ceremony champagne reception is beginning." "I'll be right there," he called, tightening his tie once more. The grand ballroom of the estate sparkled with crystal and silver. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows, catching on champagne flutes and designer jewelry. Gabriel moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations with practiced charm, while Vivienne worked the room separately, her designer gown a masterpiece of understated wealth. "You've made the right choice this time," whispered Mrs. Harrington, an old family friend, squeezing his arm. "That first wife, what was her name? So unsuitable." "Isabel," Gabriel said, the name still capable of causing a tightness in his chest. Her name was Isabel. He excused himself and moved toward the bar, needing something stronger than champagne. That's when he saw her. She moved between guests with a silver tray, her dark hair pulled back severely, eyes downcast. But he would know her anywhere, the way she moved, the slight tilt of her head as she offered champagne. "Isabel." Gabriel froze, champagne flute halfway to his lips. 8 months of questions crashed through his mind like a tidal wave. Why had she left? Where had she been? Why was she here of all places, serving drinks at his wedding? Then she turned slightly, and the loose-fitting server's uniform couldn't hide what was unmistakably a pregnancy. Far along, 7 months at least. The champagne flute slipped from his fingers but never hit the floor. His best man caught it with a laugh. Steady there, Gabe. Save the celebration for after the vows. Gabriel couldn't respond. His eyes remained locked on Isabel as calculations raced through his mind. 8 months since she'd left. 7 months pregnant. The timing. As if feeling his stare, Isabel finally looked up. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and her professional mask crumbled. Shock, pain, and something else, fear, flashed across her face. The silver tray in her hands trembled. One glass tipped, then another. In seconds, the entire tray crashed to the floor, shattering crystal and sending champagne splashing across the imported marble. The room fell silent. Everyone turned toward the commotion. "I'm sorry," Isabel whispered, though whether to the startled guests or to Gabriel, he couldn't tell. Before he could move toward her, she turned and fled through the service entrance, one hand protectively cradling her belly. What incompetence! Vivian appeared at his side, her perfectly manicured hand gripping his arm. Mother specifically requested the best service staff. She studied his face, her eyes narrowing. "Gabriel? What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I have to," he began, taking a step toward the service door. "You have to get ready for our ceremony," Vivian interrupted, her voice dropping to a steel-edged whisper. "Everyone is watching, darling." She was right. 300 pairs of eyes were fixed on them, waiting to see what would happen next. "The ceremony starts in 20 minutes, Vivian continued, her smile never wavering though her fingers dug into his arm. Whatever that was about can wait. But it couldn't. The woman he'd once loved, who disappeared without explanation, was pregnant with what could only be his child. And she was here, serving champagne at his wedding to another woman. Nothing about this made sense. "Gabriel," his father called from across the room, his tone a warning. 300 guests, 2 powerful families, 1 pregnant ex-wife, and 20 minutes until he was supposed to say, "I do." Gabriel stood frozen in place, torn between duty and the desperate need for answers. The weight of 300 expectant gazes pressed down on him like a physical force. Vivian's fingers dug deeper into his arm, her smile never faltering, though her eyes had turned to ice. "I can't do this right now," he said, his voice low but firm. "What are you talking about?" Vivian hissed through her perfect smile. "Everyone is waiting." He turned to face her directly. "I need to postpone the ceremony. There's been a family emergency." Vivian's composure cracked. "Family emergency? Your entire family is here, Gabriel." Gabriel's father approached, his expression thunderous beneath his practiced social veneer. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," Vivian answered quickly. Gabriel was just... "I need to postpone the ceremony," Gabriel interrupted. "Just for a little while." Vivian grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a quiet corner, her smile vanishing the moment they were out of direct sight. "Have you lost your mind? That was her, wasn't it? Your ex-wife, the baker's daughter?" "I need to talk to her." "On our wedding day." Vivian's voice rose dangerously. "Do you have any idea what you're risking? The Palmer-Thornton shipping merger depends on this marriage. My father made that perfectly clear." "I know what's at stake." "Do you? Because it seems like you're willing to throw away everything, our future, our family's partnership, for a woman who walked out on you." Gabriel felt something shift inside him. "I'll be back. I just need answers. If you walk out that door, there might not be a wedding to come back to." Her threat hung in the air between them. "I understand." He turned away, already scanning the room for his best man. Marcus was by the bar, watching the scene unfold with concern. Gabriel crossed to him quickly. "I need your car keys." "What's happening?" Marcus asked, already reaching into his pocket. "I need to find Isabel." Understanding dawned on Marcus's face. The pregnant waitress, that was Isabel. Jesus, Gabe. "I know. Keys, please." Marcus handed them over. Silver Audi in the East lot. What should I tell everyone? Tell them I'll be back as soon as I can. Family emergency. Gabriel slipped out through a side door before anyone else could stop him. As he drove away from the estate, memories flooded back. Meeting Isabel in college when she was working 3 jobs to pay tuition. Her laugh when he'd proposed on the public beach rather than at some exclusive restaurant. The way she'd stood up to his father at their small wedding. They'd been so happy in their modest apartment, away from his family's expectations, until his father had insisted they move back to the estate temporarily. Things had changed after that. Isabel had grown distant, anxious. And then one day, she was simply gone. No note, no explanation. Just empty drawers and a hollow space in his life he'd tried to fill with work and eventually, Vivienne. He'd called Isabel's family bakery dozens of times in those first weeks, but they'd claimed not to know where she was. Eventually, he'd stopped trying. Now he knew why. The address he'd gotten from the catering company led him to the other side of town, to an apartment building that had seen better days. He parked Marcus's luxury car and felt conspicuously out of place in his wedding tuxedo as he climbed the cracked concrete steps to the 3rd floor, apartment 3C. He knocked, heart hammering against his ribs. Silence, then the soft sound of movement inside. The door opened just a few inches, chain still in place. Isabel's brown eyes, wide with apprehension, peered out at him. Gabriel! His name on her lips sent a jolt through him. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be getting married. I need to talk to you. There's nothing to say. You're pregnant. Her hand moved instinctively to her rounded belly. You should go back to your wedding. Please, Isabel. Something in his voice must have reached her. After a long moment, she closed the door, removed the chain, and opened it again. The small apartment behind her was clean but sparse, a far cry from the life they'd shared. But it was her scent that hit him first, that familiar combination of vanilla and something uniquely Isabel. Despite everything between them, the months of silence, the hurt, the confusion, he felt that same pull toward her, that connection that had never truly broken. You shouldn't be here, she said, tears welling in her eyes. Is it mine? He asked, though he already knew the answer. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Yes. The apartment door closed with a soft click behind Gabriel. He stood awkwardly in the small living room, still in his wedding tuxedo, looking desperately out of place among Isabel's modest furnishings. A second-hand couch with a handmade quilt, a small bookshelf filled with well-worn paperbacks. It was a far cry from the coastal mansion where guests were still waiting for him to say, I do. How did you find me? Isabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The catering company. I told them I needed to thank the waitress who had an accident. Gabriel couldn't take his eyes off her belly. 7 months? Isabel nodded, one hand protectively cradling her stomach. Almost. The timeline clicked into place in Gabriel's mind. That night, before you disappeared. A flush crept up Isabel's neck. That night had been unexpected. A rare evening when they'd reconnected after weeks of growing distance. Gabriel had come home early from a business trip, and for a few precious hours, they'd been the couple they once were, before the pressures of the Thornton name had begun to crush them. I found out 2 weeks after I left. Her eyes finally met his. I wanted to tell you, but I couldn't. Why? The word came out harsher than he intended. Why would you keep this from me? Why would you just vanish without a word? Isabel sank onto the couch, suddenly looking exhausted. Your father. My father? Gabriel repeated, confusion washing over him. He came to see me the day after. That night, he said I was holding you back, that the Thornton shipping empire needed you fully committed, not distracted by a baker's daughter who couldn't possibly understand your world. Gabriel's hands clenched into fists. That sounds like him, but you never cared what he thought before. He didn't just talk, Gabriel. He showed me proof. Isabel's voice trembled. Photos of you at business functions, looking happier than you ever did with me. Reports about how the sustainable shipping division you created was thriving since you'd been focusing more on work. Articles about you being named one of the most eligible bachelors in the industry. Those were all manipulated, taken out of context. Gabriel moved closer, kneeling before her. Is that really why you left? Because my father convinced you I was better off without you. He threatened my family's bakery. Isabel's words came out in a rush now. He said he'd make sure they lost everything, their business, their home, everything, unless I disappeared from your life. He called it a generous severance package, $10,000 to walk away and never contact you again. Gabriel felt sick. And you believed him? I've known your father for 3 years, Gabriel. I know exactly what he's capable of. Her eyes hardened. The bakery is all my parents have. It's been in our family for generations. I couldn't let him destroy them. Gabriel's phone buzzed in his pocket for the 5th time. He ignored it. Did you take the money? He asked quietly. Isabel shook her head. Number. But I left anyway. Something inside Gabriel broke and mended all at once. He reached toward her belly, then hesitated. May I? After a moment's hesitation, Isabel took his hand and placed it on her rounded stomach. Almost immediately, he felt a firm kick against his palm. The sensation sent a jolt through his entire body. That's our child, he whispered, awe replacing anger. Yes. For a moment, they existed in a bubble of connection. His hand on her belly, their child moving between them, the past and future colliding in one perfect, complicated moment. Then Gabriel's phone rang again, shattering the silence. Vivian's name flashed on the screen, followed immediately by another call from his father. Reality came crashing back. You should answer, Isabel said, pulling away. They're waiting for you. Gabriel silenced the phone and placed it on the coffee table. Let them wait. I need to understand everything. He took a deep breath. My father did this. He orchestrated all of it. Our separation, your disappearance. And now I'm supposed to marry a woman I don't love to seal a business deal he arranged. I never wanted to come between you and your family, Isabel said. That's why I took the catering job. I needed the money, and I never thought you'd actually see me. The wedding was supposed to be outside. I was assigned to the indoor reception area. Does my father know? About the baby? Isabel shook her head. No one in your family knows. I've been careful. Gabriel's phone lit up again with another call from his father. This time, the sight of Richard Thornton's name filled Gabriel with a cold rage he'd never felt before. I thought you left because you didn't love me anymore, he said quietly. All these months, I've been trying to convince myself that what I felt for Vivian was enough, that I could build a life with her. But seeing you today... He looked up at Isabel, his blue eyes intense. Nothing's been right since you left. Gabriel drove back to the Thornton estate with his mind spinning. The coastal road that had seemed so bright with promise this morning now felt like a path to a trap. His father had manipulated everything. Isabel's disappearance, his relationship with Vivian, even his own feelings. The realization burned in his chest like acid. The estate came into view, sprawling and majestic against the backdrop of the ocean. Guests milled about on the lawn, champagne glasses in hand, their confusion evident even from a distance. Gabriel parked Marcus's car haphazardly and strode toward the main house, ignoring the whispers that followed him. He found his father, Richard, in his study, a wood-paneled sanctuary filled with maritime artifacts and family portraits. The Thornton legacy stared down at him from every wall, generations of stern-faced men who had built their fortune on the sea. Gabriel had once felt proud to be among them. Now they looked like strangers. Richard stood by the window, phone in hand. He turned as Gabriel entered, his expression a careful mask of concern. "There you are. Everyone's waiting. What's this emergency Marcus mentioned?" Richard's voice was controlled, betraying nothing. Gabriel shut the door behind him. "I saw Isabel today." Richard's expression flickered for just a moment before settling back into neutral. "Ah, the Waitress incident. Unfortunate timing on her part." "She's pregnant," Gabriel said flatly, "with my child." Richard sighed, setting his phone down on the mahogany desk. "And you believe her? How convenient that she shows up on your wedding day with this claim." "It's not a claim. It's the truth." Gabriel's voice rose. "And you threatened her family to make her leave me." Richard's face hardened. "I protected you from a gold digger who would have derailed everything you've worked for, everything I've built for you." "Gold digger?" Gabriel's laugh was bitter. "Isabel refused the watch I bought her for her birthday because it was too extravagant. She insisted on paying her half of dinner whenever we went out. She loved me for me, not for the Thornton name or money." "She's manipulating you," Richard countered, moving to pour himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the sideboard. "Think about it, Gabriel. Why would she return now, just as you're about to marry into one of the wealthiest families on the coast?" She saw an opportunity. "She didn't return. She was working, trying to make ends meet because you threatened to destroy her family's livelihood." Gabriel stepped closer, his voice dangerously quiet. "She's 7 months pregnant, living in a one-bedroom apartment across town, and she never took a penny from you." Richard's expression wavered. "The Palmer merger is crucial. You know that." A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus poked his head in, looking uncomfortable. "Sorry to interrupt, but Vivian's father is asking to speak with both of you. He seems concerned about the delay." Richard nodded. "Tell him we'll be right there." When Marcus left, Richard turned back to Gabriel. "Your sustainable shipping venture is 3 months from bankruptcy without the Palmer investment. Everything you've built, all your innovations, gone. Is that what you want?" The words hit Gabriel like a physical blow. His division had been struggling, true, but he hadn't realized how dire the situation was. Or was this another of his father's manipulations? "You would use my own company against me?" Gabriel asked quietly. "I'm trying to save your future," Richard insisted. "The Palmers are getting restless. Vivian is humiliated. If you walk away now, the merger falls apart." The door opened again, and this time Vivian entered with her father, Harold Palmer, a silver-haired man with cold eyes and a perpetual frown. "I think we deserve an explanation," Harold said without preamble. 200 guests are waiting, and my daughter has been made to look foolish." Vivian stepped forward, her wedding dress rustling. "Gabriel, whatever's happening, we can discuss it after the ceremony. The photographer says we're losing the perfect light." "My division," Gabriel said slowly. "Is it really facing bankruptcy?" Harold Palmer's expression confirmed Richard's claim. "Without our investment, yes. The sustainable shipping model is admirable, but not yet profitable. We were prepared to keep it afloat as part of our family's union." Gabriel felt the walls closing in. Outside the window, he could see guests checking their watches, whispering among themselves. His business, his dream of revolutionizing the shipping industry with environmentally responsible practices, hung in the balance. Years of work, hundreds of jobs, his entire vision for the future. And then there was Isabel, alone in that small apartment, carrying his child. Isabel, who had sacrificed her own happiness to protect her family from his father's threats. Gabriel looked around the room at the expectant faces. His father's calculating gaze, Vivian's impatient frown, Harold's cold assessment. The weight of the Thornton legacy pressed down on him from the portraits above. "I need to know the truth," he said finally, turning to his father. All of it, before I make any decision." Richard's face darkened. "You can't be serious." "I am." Gabriel stood firm, his shoulders squared. "The wedding is postponed for 1 week." Vivienne gasped, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth. "Gabriel, you can't do this to me. To us." 1 week, Gabriel repeated, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around him. "I need time to understand what's happened, what's still happening." Harold Palmer's face flushed crimson. "This is completely unacceptable. The contracts—" "We'll still be there in 7 days," Gabriel cut in. "If everything is as straightforward as you all claim, then a week changes nothing." The study door burst open as Gabriel's mother entered, her face a mask of social anxiety. "The guests are asking questions. The caterers need direction. What should I tell them?" Richard stepped forward, ever the crisis manager. "Tell them there's been an unexpected family situation. The ceremony will be rescheduled." "I'll make the announcement myself," Gabriel said, moving toward the door. Vivienne grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in. "If you walk out there and postpone this wedding, you're humiliating me in front of everyone who matters." Gabriel looked into her eyes, beautiful, calculating eyes that had never looked at him the way Isabel's had. "I'm sorry, Vivienne, but I won't make a lifetime commitment while there are lies between us." After a few hours, "I need everything you can find," Gabriel said, pacing across Marcus's office at Thornton Shipping headquarters the next morning. "Financial records, communications, security footage from 8 months ago, anything that shows my father's involvement with Isabel's disappearance." Marcus leaned back in his chair, concern etched across his features. "You realize I'm investigating the CEO of the company I work for? The man who signs my paychecks?" "And my father," Gabriel added quietly. "I know what I'm asking." Marcus nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I always thought Isabel's disappearance seemed off. She loved you too much to just walk away. That's why I need your help. If my father threatened her family, there must be evidence." "I'll be discreet," Marcus promised. "But Gabriel, be careful. Your father doesn't play fair when he feels cornered." Gabriel threw himself into work during the days that followed, reviewing contracts and meeting with department heads at his sustainable shipping division. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was fighting to save a company that his father might use as leverage against him. But the evenings belonged to Isabel. The first night he arrived with takeout from their favorite restaurant. But by the third evening, he found himself in her tiny kitchen, sleeves rolled up, following her instructions on how to chop vegetables. "You've never actually cooked before, have you?" Isabel asked, a smile playing at her lips as she watched him struggle with an onion. Gabriel shook his head, laughing. The Thornton household had staff for that. "Here," she said, moving behind him. Her arms reached around to guide his hands, her pregnant belly pressing gently against his back. Like this. The simple intimacy of the moment took his breath away. This was what had been missing with Vivienne, this easy, natural connection that required no performance. Later, as they sat at her small table eating pasta that was slightly overcooked but somehow perfect, Gabriel found himself sharing details about his division's financial struggles. "You always believed in sustainable shipping, even when your father called it a waste of resources," Isabel said, her brown eyes warm with understanding. "I was so proud of you for that." "Remember when we met?" Gabriel asked, twirling pasta around his fork. "At the marina?" Isabel smiled, the memory lighting up her face. "You were trying to fix that old boat engine, and I was serving ice cream to tourists between my other 2 jobs. You thought I was just another rich kid playing with expensive toys." "You were," she teased. "But you were also kind to that little boy who dropped his ice cream. Most people wouldn't have noticed him crying." Gabriel remembered how he'd bought the child another cone, how Isabel had watched him with curious eyes afterward. That was the first time you really looked at me." "I saw you," she said simply. "Not the Thornton name or the money, just you." Each evening strengthened what Gabriel had been trying to deny for 8 months. What he had with Isabel was real in a way his relationship with Vivian had never been. With Vivian, every interaction felt like a business negotiation, every touch calculated for effect. With Isabel, even sitting in comfortable silence felt right. "Any news from Marcus?" she asked on the 4th night as they washed dishes side by side. Gabriel shook his head. "Not yet. But he'll find something. I know my father did this." Isabel rested her hand on her swollen belly. "I'm scared, Gabriel. Your father is powerful. And the Palmers—" "Let me worry about them," Gabriel said, covering her hand with his own. Their child kicked against his palm, and the reality of what he stood to lose hit him with stunning clarity. Days later, Gabriel's phone buzzed on his desk at Thornton Shipping. Marcus's name flashed on the screen. "I found it," Marcus said, his voice tight. "You need to see this, now." 20 minutes later, Gabriel stared at the documents spread across Marcus's desk, each one more damning than the last. His stomach clenched as the truth materialized before him. These photos. Gabriel picked up the grainy images showing Isabel appearing to embrace another man. "They're fake?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Expertly manipulated. Look at the shadows. They don't match. And this man? He's a Thornton Holdings employee from the Miami office. He was paid to be in these staged photos." Gabriel's hands trembled as he set down the pictures and picked up financial statements. "And these? Bank transfers made to look like Isabel accepted money to leave you, but they're fabricated. The account numbers lead nowhere. It's all smoke and mirrors." Marcus hesitated. "There's more. Your father hired private investigators to follow her, threatened her parents' bakery with health code violations that would shut them down, and even arranged for her apartment lease to be terminated." Gabriel closed his eyes, bile rising in his throat. "He orchestrated everything." "I'm sorry, Gabriel, but there's no question. Your father systematically removed Isabel from your life." As Gabriel left Marcus's office, his phone buzzed with Vivian's name. It was the 3rd call today. "Gabriel, darling." Vivian's voice was honey-coated, but with an unmistakable edge. "We need to discuss rescheduling the wedding. The Palms Resort has an opening next Saturday, and Daddy says we should secure it immediately." "I need more time, Vivian." "Time for what exactly?" "You've been disappearing every evening this week. People are talking." Gabriel pinched the bridge of his nose. "I'll call you later." "Gabriel!" He ended the call before she could protest further. That evening, Gabriel arrived at Isabel's apartment with a paper bag tucked under his arm. Her eyes widened when he unpacked its contents on her kitchen counter. Prenatal vitamins and baby books. Isabel picked up a colorful hardcover titled, "What to Expect." "I should have been here for all of it," Gabriel said softly. "I want to catch up on what I've missed." Isabel's eyes glistened. "You don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted, reaching for her hand. "Please." Later, as they sat together on her worn sofa reading through the development stages, Isabel suddenly gasped and grabbed Gabriel's hand, placing it on her rounded belly. "Wait, feel this." A moment passed, then Gabriel felt it, a distinct push against his palm. His breath caught. "That's our baby," he whispered, awe transforming his features. Isabel's eyes met his, and the connection between them crackled with electricity. Without thinking, Gabriel leaned forward until their foreheads touched, breathing in the scent that had haunted his dreams for 8 months. "I never stopped loving you," he confessed, the words escaping before he could catch them. That night, when Vivian met him at his penthouse with wedding venue brochures, Gabriel felt like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Her perfect makeup, designer dress, calculating eyes that had never looked at him the way Isabel's had. When she leaned in to kiss him goodnight, Gabriel turned his face away. "What's wrong?" Vivian demanded, eyes narrowing. "I can't do this," Gabriel said simply. Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. "It's her, isn't it? Your pregnant waitress?" Gabriel didn't answer. He didn't need to. The next morning, Gabriel marched into Thornton shipping headquarters, evidence folder clutched in his hand. He bypassed his father's assistant and pushed open the heavy mahogany door. Richard Thornton looked up from his desk, irritation flashing across his face. "Gabriel, I'm in the middle of—" "I know what you did to Isabel." Gabriel slapped the folder onto the desk. "I know everything." Richard's face remained impassive as he glanced at the contents. "You don't understand business or family legacy, son. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made." "Difficult decisions?" Gabriel's voice rose. "You threatened her family. You faked evidence of infidelity. You manipulated both of us." "She wasn't good enough for you," Richard suddenly shouted, standing up. "A baker's daughter serving ice cream at the marina? The Thornton name means something in this world." "She was everything to me," Gabriel said, his voice breaking. "And you took her away." Richard's face flushed dark red. "She would have held you back from your potential, from the connections someone like Vivian brings." "No, Father. You're wrong. Isabel made me better. She made me want to be better." Gabriel stepped closer. "And now she's carrying your grandchild." Richard's face suddenly contorted. He clutched at his chest, eyes widening in pain. "Gabriel!" he gasped before crumpling forward onto his desk. "Father!" Gabriel rushed forward as Richard slid to the floor, face ashen. "Someone call an ambulance!" he shouted toward the door. Richard's fingers dug into Gabriel's sleeve. "Never thought she was good enough. For the Thornton legacy," he wheezed, before his eyes rolled back and his body went limp. The hospital room's mechanical hum provided a sterile soundtrack to Gabriel's vigil. Richard Thornton, the man who commanded boardrooms and bent corporate rivals to his will, now lay diminished against starched white pillows, an oxygen tube snaking beneath his nose. Monitors tracked his heartbeat in glowing green peaks and valleys. Gabriel checked his phone again. 3 missed calls from Isabel. He should call her back, but what would he say? That he was sitting beside the man who had systematically destroyed their marriage. "You're still here." Richard's voice, normally commanding, emerged as a rasp. Gabriel slipped his phone into his pocket. "Yes." Richard's eyes, the same piercing blue as Gabriel's own, studied him with unexpected vulnerability. "You don't have to be." "I know." A nurse entered, checked Richard's vitals, and adjusted his IV before departing with a sympathetic smile toward Gabriel. "The doctor says it was a warning," Richard said after she left. "Not the main event." "You're lucky." Richard's laugh transformed into a cough. "Lucky," he repeated when he could speak again. "Is that what this is?" Gabriel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Why did you do it, Dad? Really?" Richard turned his gaze to the window. "I started with nothing, you know that. Everything I built, everything the Thornton name stands for, I wanted to protect it. By destroying my marriage, by securing your future." Richard's fingers plucked restlessly at the blanket. "But seeing you these past months, you were never happy with Vivian, were you?" The admission stunned Gabriel into silence. "I thought I knew what was best," Richard continued, voice softening. Perhaps I was wrong." Gabriel stared at his father, searching for manipulation in those familiar features, but finding only exhaustion and something he'd rarely seen before: regret. Across town, Isabel carefully measured flour for the bread she was baking, when a sharp knock interrupted her concentration. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and waddled to the door, one hand supporting her lower back. When she opened it, Vivian Palmer stood in the hallway, immaculate in a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than Isabel's monthly rent. "May I come in?" Vivian didn't wait for an answer, brushing past Isabel into the apartment. Isabel closed the door, heart pounding. "Gabriel isn't here." "I know exactly where Gabriel is." Vivian surveyed the modest apartment with thinly veiled disdain. "He's at his father's hospital bedside, where he belongs, with his family." Isabel placed a protective hand over her belly. "What do you want, Vivian?" "To be clear about certain realities." Vivian's perfectly manicured finger traced a line across Isabel's kitchen counter. "Gabriel may be experiencing some nostalgia at the moment, but the Thorntons take care of their own." Meaning that once your child is born, the family will naturally seek custody arrangements. The Thornton heir should be raised with all the advantages of the family name, don't you think? The room seemed to tilt. Isabel gripped the counter edge. "Get out." "We have excellent attorneys," Vivian continued as if Isabel hadn't spoken, "and resources you can't imagine. It would be better for everyone if you—" "I said get out." Isabel's voice broke. Vivian smiled coldly. "Think about it. You really should avoid stress in your condition." She walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. "Oh, and Gabriel doesn't know I'm here. Let's keep it that way, shall we?" After Vivian left, Isabel sank to the kitchen floor, tears streaming down her face. She reached for her phone with trembling hands. Gabriel found Isabel curled on her sofa, eyes red and swollen. He'd left the hospital the moment he heard her tearful voice on the phone. "What happened?" he asked, kneeling beside her. When she told him about Vivian's visit, Gabriel's face darkened with fury. "She had no right. None of that is true, Isabel. I would never." "But your family could, couldn't they?" Isabel's voice was small. "Take our baby." "No." Gabriel took her hands in his. "No one is taking our child from you. I promise." A sob escaped her, and without thinking, Gabriel gathered her into his arms. Isabel stiffened momentarily before melting against him, her face pressed into his shoulder. It was the first time they had embraced since she'd disappeared from his life, and the familiar contours of her body against his unleashed a flood of memories and emotions. "I'm so scared," she whispered against his neck. "I know." He stroked her hair, breathing in her scent. "But you're not alone anymore. I'm here now." Isabel pulled back slightly, her tear-stained face inches from his. Their eyes locked, and Gabriel felt himself drawn toward her, the magnetic pull between them as powerful as it had always been. He leaned forward, his lips nearly touching hers. The next morning, Gabriel raced through the hospital corridors, his phone clutched in his hand. The call from his father's doctor had been urgent. Richard had taken a turn for the worse and was asking for him. As he rounded the corner toward the cardiac unit, a nurse called out to him. "Mr. Thornton, your father's awake but very weak. He's insisting on speaking with you alone." Gabriel nodded and entered the dimly lit room. Richard looked smaller somehow, diminished against the white hospital sheets. Monitors beeped steadily beside him. "Gabriel," Richard's voice was barely audible. "I need to tell you everything before it's too late." "Save your strength, Dad." "No." Richard's hand trembled as he reached for his son. "There's more you don't know about Isabel." Gabriel tensed. "What about her?" "Her brother, the boy, got into trouble last year. Drug possession." Richard's breathing grew labored. "I made it go away, but I used it to control her. Told her if she contacted you, I'd make sure he served maximum time." The revelation hit Gabriel like a physical blow. "You blackmailed her? Even after she left?" Richard nodded weakly. "Whenever she tried to reach you, I intercepted, threatened her family. I was wrong, son. So wrong. Gabriel stepped back, disgust and fury warring within him. All this time I thought she'd abandoned me, abandoned us, when you were the one. I'm sorry, Richard whispered, tears sliding down his weathered face. Can you forgive me? Before Gabriel could answer, his phone vibrated. A text from Marcus. Emergency. Isabel in hospital. Early contractions. Same hospital maternity wing. Hurry. Gabriel's blood ran cold. He looked from the message to his father, torn between the man who had manipulated his entire life and the woman carrying his child. Go to her, Richard said, reading his expression. Make it right. Across the hospital, Isabel gripped the sides of the bed as another contraction seized her. Marcus stood awkwardly beside her, looking utterly out of his element. I've called Gabriel 6 times, he said. He must still be with his father. It's too early, Isabel gasped as the pain subsided. The baby's not due for another month. A doctor entered, scanning her chart. Mrs. Thornton. Ms. Rivera, Isabel corrected automatically. The doctor looked confused. I apologize. The staff mentioned you were Mr. Thornton's wife. Ex-wife, Isabel clarified, wincing as another contraction began. We need to stop these contractions, the doctor said. Premature labor at 32 weeks poses significant risks. I'm ordering medication to try to halt the process. A commotion outside the room drew their attention. Vivian's voice carried clearly through the door. What do you mean Gabriel's ex-wife is here, in labor? Her tone was sharp with indignation. Why wasn't I informed immediately? Marcus stepped into the hallway, closing Isabel's door behind him. Through the glass panel, Isabel could see him confronting Vivian, whose perfect composure was cracking visibly. Gabriel stood frozen at the junction of 2 hospital corridors. To his left lay the cardiac unit where his father was possibly taking his last breaths. To his right, the maternity wing where Isabel and their unborn child needed him. Vivian appeared suddenly, her face flushed with anger. There you are. Your father is dying and you're what? Running to that woman? Now? Gabriel looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing but relief at the clarity of his choice. Yes, he said simply. I am. He turned away from her, from his father, from the life that had been carefully constructed for him, and ran toward the maternity ward. When he burst into Isabel's room, she was pale and frightened, monitors beeping around her. Her eyes widened at the sight of him. Gabriel? Your father. Doesn't matter right now. He moved to her side, taking her hand in his. Nothing matters except you and our baby. The doctor looked up from examining her. We're concerned about premature labor, Mr. Thornton. The stress has triggered contractions that could endanger both mother and child. Gabriel's grip on Isabel's hand tightened. What can we do? We've started medication to stop the contractions. The next few hours will be critical. Isabel's eyes filled with tears. Gabriel, you should be with your father. If he's dying. No. Gabriel's voice was firm as he brushed damp hair from her forehead. I've made my choice, Isabel. I'm exactly where I need to be, and I promise you, I will not leave your side again, no matter what. A nurse appeared at the doorway. Mr. Thornton, they're asking for you in the cardiac unit. It's urgent. Gabriel didn't even turn around. Tell them I'm sorry, but I can't come. My priority is here now. Isabel's eyes widened at his public declaration. In that moment, as he held her hand and faced the future they might build together, Gabriel knew he'd finally made the right choice. The steady beep of monitors filled the hospital room as darkness fell. The medical team had finally stabilized Isabel, administering medication that halted her premature contractions. Gabriel sat in an uncomfortable chair pulled close to her bed, his hand still wrapped protectively around hers even as she drifted in and out of sleep. When a nurse suggested he go home to rest, he firmly shook his head. "I'm staying," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The night shift nurse smiled knowingly as she checked Isabel's vitals. "I'll bring you a blanket then." As the hospital quieted for the night, Gabriel watched Isabel's face in the soft glow of the monitoring equipment. The worry lines that had creased her forehead earlier had smoothed out in sleep, making her look younger, more like the woman he'd fallen in love with years ago. When Isabel stirred slightly, Gabriel leaned closer, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Remember that picnic?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the machines. "The one I surprised you with after your final exams? I drove you out to that cliff overlooking the ocean." Isabel's lips curved slightly, though her eyes remained closed. "I spent 3 days planning it," Gabriel continued, smiling at the memory. "Borrowed Marcus's truck because I didn't want to show up in my father's car, spread that old blanket under the biggest tree and waited until dark so we could see the stars." He chuckled softly. "You were so surprised when I pulled out that telescope I'd borrowed from the astronomy department." As the night deepened, Gabriel continued his whispered journey through their past. "Remember when I tried to learn your grandmother's chocolate cake recipe? I was so determined to impress you." "You put salt instead of sugar," Isabel murmured, her eyes still closed but a smile playing on her lips. Gabriel squeezed her hand. "You laughed so hard you had tears running down your face, but you still ate a piece." "It was terrible," she whispered. "But you ate it anyway. That's when I knew." "Knew what?" Isabel's eyes fluttered open, finding his in the dim light. "That I'd never find anyone who would love me the way you did. The real me, not the Thornton heir." Isabel's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Gabriel, remember those Sunday mornings in our apartment? Reading by that big window, your feet in my lap, rain pattering outside?" She nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek. "I've never been that peaceful since you left," Gabriel admitted. "Not once." The intimate moment shattered as the door swung open. Vivian stood in the entrance, her perfect appearance at odds with the sterile hospital environment. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene before her. Gabriel holding Isabel's hand, their faces close together, lost in shared memories. "So this is where you've been hiding," Vivian said coldly. "Your father might be dying down the hall, but you're here with her." Gabriel straightened but didn't release Isabel's hand. "My father is stable. Isabel needed me." "And I don't?" Vivienne stepped fully into the room, her heels clicking sharply on the linoleum floor. "Our wedding is supposed to be rescheduled. The Palmers are waiting for an answer. I need a decision, Gabriel. Now." Gabriel looked from Vivienne to Isabel, the contrast between them striking, one representing the life planned for him, the other the life he'd chosen for himself once before. "The wedding is off, Vivian," he said quietly but firmly. "I'm sorry." Vivian's composure cracked. "You can't be serious. After everything." "I never stopped loving her," Gabriel said, the simple truth of it washing over him like a wave. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the engagement ring he'd been carrying. "You deserve someone who loves you the way you should be loved. That's not me." He extended the ring toward her. Vivian stared at it, then at him, her expression hardening. "You realize what this means, don't you? My father will pull his investment. Your sustainable shipping division will collapse without our backing." Gabriel nodded. "I know. Financial ruin, Gabriel. Everything you've built, gone. Some things matter more." His hand remained steady, the ring glinting under the fluorescent lights. Vivian snatched the ring, her eyes flashing with hurt and anger. "You'll regret this." She turned on her heel and stormed out, her departure audible all the way down the corridor. Isabel squeezed Gabriel's hand. "Gabriel, your company—" "We'll figure it out," he said, bringing her hand to his lips. From down the hall came the sound of raised voices, then quick footsteps. A nurse appeared at the doorway. "Mr. Thornton, your father is asking for you. He overheard Ms. Palmer leaving." Gabriel looked torn. Isabel released his hand. "Go," she urged. "I'll be fine." Gabriel hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be right back. I promise." In his father's room, Richard looked frailer than before, the machines around him a stark reminder of his mortality. His eyes, however, were clear and focused. "You broke it off with Vivienne," Richard said, his voice weak but steady. "Yes. For Isabel." Gabriel nodded. Richard was quiet for a long moment, then gestured weakly to a chair. "Sit, son." Gabriel sat, wary of what might come next. "I was wrong," Richard said, the words clearly difficult for him. "About Isabel, about you, about what matters." He took a labored breath. "I spent my life building an empire, thinking that's what would make you strong. Instead, I nearly destroyed the one thing that actually did." Gabriel stared at his father, stunned by this unexpected vulnerability. "I'll make it right," Richard continued. "The Palmer investment. I'll replace it. Your division won't fail." "Dad, you don't have to—" "Let me do this," Richard interrupted, reaching for Gabriel's hand, a gesture so unfamiliar that Gabriel almost pulled away in surprise. "Let me be your father, not just your CEO for once." As their hands connected, Gabriel felt something shift between them, the first genuine moment of father-son understanding they'd shared in years. In the sterile hospital room, surrounded by beeping monitors and the smell of antiseptic, a new foundation was being laid. In the weeks following the hospital drama, the Thornton estate felt different, quieter, more genuine. Richard had been discharged with strict orders to rest, a concept foreign to the business titan. Gabriel divided his time between the family mansion, his office, and Isabel's small apartment, juggling responsibilities that suddenly seemed to align rather than conflict. One morning, Gabriel arrived at his father's study to find Richard surrounded by legal documents, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Should you be working?" Gabriel asked, setting down a cup of tea beside his father. Richard looked up, the lines in his face deeper than before his heart attack. "Some things can't wait." He pushed a document across the desk. "I'm restructuring my will and the company holdings." Gabriel skimmed the legal text, his eyes widening. "You're separating my sustainable division from the main company assets?" "With independent funding," Richard confirmed. "The Palmer investment would have been convenient, but not necessary." His fingers drummed lightly on the desk. "Your vision deserves protection, regardless of who you marry." Gabriel looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw not just the intimidating businessman, but a man confronting his mistakes. "Why now?" Gabriel asked. Richard's gaze drifted to the window overlooking the harbor. Nearly dying has a way of clarifying priorities. He turned back to Gabriel. "I spent decades choosing business over family. I won't make that mistake again." That afternoon across town, Gabriel helped Isabel unpack boxes in her new apartment. It was comfortable but modest, a second-floor unit with large windows and a small balcony overlooking a community garden. Most importantly, it was in a safe neighborhood with good schools nearby. "You really don't have to do this," Isabel said as Gabriel assembled a crib, instruction manual spread across the floor. "I want to," he replied, tightening a bolt. "Besides, I'm becoming quite the furniture assembly expert." Isabel smiled, resting her hand on her growing belly. "Our child will be impressed by your Allen wrench skills." "Our child," Gabriel repeated softly, the words still new and wonderful. Their new routine had developed naturally. Gabriel arrived each morning with breakfast, often fresh pastries from her family's bakery, before heading to work. Weekends were devoted to preparing the nursery, painting walls a soft yellow and arranging stuffed animals on shelves. Evenings found them sharing simple meals, talking about their days, their hopes, their fears. They were rediscovering each other, not as the college sweethearts or the briefly married couple they had been, but as the people they had become during their separation. Gabriel was less concerned with appearances now, more focused on substance. Isabel was stronger, more certain of her boundaries. "My father asked about you today," Gabriel said one evening as they washed dishes side by side. "He wanted to know if you needed anything for the baby." Isabel paused, soapy plate in hand. "That's unexpected." "He's changing," Gabriel replied. "Or trying to." "People can surprise you," she said, passing him the plate to dry. "Sometimes in good ways." The marina where they first met hadn't changed much over the years. The same weathered docks, the same salt-tinged air, the same rhythmic sound of halyards tapping against masts. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Gabriel and Isabel walked slowly along the waterfront. "I was working 3 jobs that summer," Isabel recalled, her hand resting comfortably in Gabriel's. "Waiting tables, teaching sailing to kids, and helping at the marina office. And I was the entitled rich kid trying to prove I could sail without my father's help," Gabriel added with a self-deprecating smile. "You were terrible," she laughed. "I got better." "You did," she agreed, her expression softening. "In many ways." They stopped at the end of the dock, watching fishing boats return with the tide. The moment felt right, not perfect, but honest. "Isabel," Gabriel began, turning to face her. "I know we're different people now. We've both changed. But some things haven't." He took a deep breath. "I still love you. I think I always have, even when I tried to convince myself otherwise." Isabel's eyes glistened in the fading light. "Gabriel, I'm not asking for promises," he continued. "Just a chance. Could we consider a future together again? Not just for the baby, but for us." She was quiet for a long moment, the gentle lapping of waves against the dock filling the silence. "One day at a time," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. "I'd like that." Relief and joy washed over Gabriel's face. Isabel took his hand and placed it on her belly, just as the baby delivered a strong kick. "Someone else agrees," she smiled. Together, they stood watching the boats come in with the tide, the future before them uncertain, but full of possibility. 2 months later, rain lashed against the windows of Isabel's apartment as she doubled over in pain, clutching her swollen belly. "Gabriel," she gasped, gripping the kitchen counter. "I think it's time." Gabriel dropped the book he'd been reading and was at her side in seconds. "Are you sure? You're not due for another week." Another contraction hit, stronger than the first. Isabel nodded, her face pale. "Very sure." Outside, the wind howled as the worst storm of the season battered the coast. Lightning flashed, illuminating the darkened apartment as the power flickered and died. "Perfect timing," Gabriel muttered, helping Isabel into her raincoat while gathering the hospital bag they'd packed weeks ago. "Don't worry, we'll make it." The drive to the hospital became a harrowing journey through streets rapidly flooding with rainwater. Gabriel gripped the steering wheel, navigating around fallen branches and through intersections where traffic lights had gone dark. Beside him, Isabel breathed through contractions that came with increasing frequency. "Almost there," he reassured her, reaching for her hand at a momentary stop. "You're doing great." "This baby," Isabel said through gritted teeth, "has your terrible sense of timing." When they finally reached the hospital, it was operating on emergency generators. Staff rushed Isabel to the maternity ward while Gabriel followed, refusing to leave her side even as nurses suggested he wait outside. "I'm staying," he said firmly, his eyes never leaving Isabel's. "I promised I wouldn't leave her again." Throughout the night, as the storm raged outside, Isabel fought through a difficult labor. Gabriel wiped her brow, held her hand through each contraction, and whispered encouragement when she felt she couldn't continue. "You're the strongest person I know," he told her, pressing his forehead against hers during a brief respite between contractions. "You can do this. We can do this." As dawn broke, the storm began to subside. The first rays of sunlight pierced through parting clouds just as the doctor announced, "One more push." With a final tremendous effort, Isabel brought their daughter into the world. The baby's first cry filled the room as Gabriel stood transfixed, tears streaming down his face. "She's beautiful," he whispered, as the nurses placed the tiny, red-faced infant on Isabel's chest, just like her mother. While Isabel and the baby were moved to a recovery room, Gabriel slipped away briefly. When Isabel awoke from a short, exhausted sleep, she gasped in surprise. The sterile hospital room had been transformed. Strings of fairy lights cast a warm glow across the walls, and vases of fresh flowers, somehow procured despite the storm, filled every surface. "You remembered," she said softly, recognizing the recreation of their first date at the Marina Cafe, where string lights had hung above their table and wildflowers had adorned each setting. "I never forgot a single detail," Gabriel replied, cradling their sleeping daughter. He carefully placed the baby in Isabel's arms before kneeling beside the bed. From his pocket, he withdrew not a new ring, but a familiar gold band. Her original wedding ring. "I kept this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when I thought you were never coming back, I couldn't let it go." He took her hand gently. "Isabel, these past months have shown me what truly matters. Will you marry me again? I promise that this time nothing will come between us." Tears streamed down Isabel's face as she looked from their daughter to the ring she'd once thought lost forever. "Yes," she whispered, as Gabriel slipped the band onto her finger. "Yes." 6 weeks later, a gentle breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine across the small stretch of beach where white chairs had been arranged in a semicircle. Unlike the ostentatious venue of Gabriel's almost wedding to Vivian, this ceremony site was simple, a wooden arch draped with sunset-colored flowers overlooking the same marina where Gabriel and Isabel had first met years ago. In a small tent serving as a makeshift bridal suite, Isabel adjusted the simple lace dress that flowed loosely around her post-pregnancy figure. She held their daughter Emma against her shoulder, the baby dressed in a tiny white gown with a crown of miniature flowers. A knock sounded at the tent flap. "May I come in?" Richard Thornton's voice was tentative, lacking its usual commanding tone. "Yes," Isabel answered, steeling herself. Richard entered slowly, leaning on a cane. His illness had diminished his imposing presence, but his eyes remained sharp. He stood awkwardly before her, looking at his granddaughter with wonder. "She has the Thornton eyes," he said softly. "But her grandmother's smile," Isabel replied, thinking of her own mother. Richard nodded, then drew a deep breath. "Isabel, I know words are insufficient, but I need to say them anyway. What I did to you, to both of you, was unforgivable. Yet here you are, asking for forgiveness," Isabel said, her voice steady. "Not expecting it. Just hoping." Richard's voice cracked. "I thought I was protecting the Thornton legacy, but I nearly destroyed the best part of it." He gestured toward Emma. "You've shown more strength and dignity than I've demonstrated in my entire life. You would have been an asset to our family from the beginning, had I only seen it." Isabel studied the man who had caused her so much pain. "I'm not doing this for you, Richard. I'm doing it for Gabriel, for Emma, and for myself. We all deserve a fresh start." "Thank you," Richard whispered, genuine gratitude in his eyes. Outside, only 30 guests waited, true friends and family rather than business associates and social climbers. Marcus stood as Gabriel's best man, while Isabel's sister held a small bouquet as maid of honor. When the music began, Gabriel turned to watch Isabel approach with Emma in her arms. His eyes filled with tears at the sight of them. His real family, not the artificial one he'd nearly settled for. Under the flower-covered arch, they stood facing each other, their daughter cradled between them. The officiant spoke briefly about second chances and hard-won wisdom before Gabriel and Isabel exchanged vows they had written themselves. "I promise to choose you every day," Gabriel said, his voice steady and sure. "Not just when it's easy, but especially when it's difficult. I promise to build our life on honesty, not expectations." Isabel's voice trembled slightly as she responded. "I promise to trust in our love, to remember that together we're stronger than any force that tries to separate us. I promise to create a family built on truth and acceptance." After the ceremony, as guests mingled on the beach, Gabriel led Isabel to the water's edge. The setting sun painted the horizon in shades of gold and pink. "I have something to show you," he said, pointing toward the marina. There, bobbing gently in its slip, was a beautifully restored sailboat. "Our honeymoon awaits. I've been restoring it while waiting for Emma to arrive." "It's perfect," Isabel whispered, leaning against him as Emma slept in her arms. They stood together, watching the sunset transform the water into liquid fire. A family forged in adversity, stronger for having been tested, and finally free to chart their own course. If you enjoyed this story, I've found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the video in front of you to experience this beautiful story before it's gone.